Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. That's what the research shows. But the drug war, not by accident, has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now, that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who's a drug dealer. You know, if you picture a drug dealer in your mind, you're probably picturing some black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging. Plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A white kid living in rural Kansas doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his cocaine. No, he gets it most likely from someone of his own race down the road. In fact, where significant differences in the survey data appear, it frequently suggests that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. Now, I find that many people, when they see the data, they're stunned, and they say, yeah, that's awful. Those racial disparities, it's astounding. But still, we need to be waging a drug war in those ghetto communities, because that's where the violent offenders can be found. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. They say it makes sense to wage the drug war in the ghetto communities because we have to get tough with them. That's where the violence is. Indeed, in my experience, most people seem to imagine that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine and the related violence. And for a while, I believed that too. But it's not true. It's not the case. President Ronald Reagan declared the current drug war in 1982 at a time when drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise. He declared the drug war before, not after, crack became a media sensation and was ravaging inner city communities. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared his drug war, drug crime was actually on the decline, and less than 3% of the American population identified drugs as the nation's most pressing concern. So why declare a drug war at a time when drug crime is declining and the American population isn't much concerned about drugs? Well, the answer is that from the outset, the drug war had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or drug abuse, and nearly everything to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded, get-tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working-class whites in the South who were resentful of, fearful of, anxious about many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, to be fair, I think we have to acknowledge that poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. You know, wealthy whites, they could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who might be bused across town to go to a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then to make matters worse from their perspective, affirmative action programs created the perception that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on their way to Harvard and Yale and fancy jobs in corporate America. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, resentment, anger, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group of people not so suddenly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. In fact, in the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he explained the strategy this way, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. A couple years after the drug war was announced, crack cocaine began to ravage inner city communities. And the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to feed to the media stories of inner-city crack babies and crack deals and the so-called crack whores and crack-related violence. Their goal was to make crack a media sensation in the hopes that it would bolster public support for a drug war they had already declared and persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores. And a wave of punitiveness swept over the United States, and soon Congress was passing harsh mandatory minimums for possession of small amounts of crack cocaine and other drugs, sentences harsher than murderers receive in some other Western democracies. And soon, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was President Clinton that championed laws denying federal financial aid to drug offenders for college. It was President Clinton who championed laws banning people with criminal convictions from access to public housing so that people wouldn't have housing upon release from prison. It was the Clinton administration that championed laws denying even food stamps under federal law to people who were once caught with drugs. To a large extent, the basic architecture of this new caste system was championed by a Democratic administration desperate to win back the so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. Still, in my experience, many people who are familiar with this history defend the drug war and mass incarceration nonetheless. They say, but what about all those drug kingpins, and what about the violence in our communities? Don't we need this war to deal with them? And it is true. We need an aggressive approach to dealing with the violence that plagues our communities. But let's be clear, this drug war has never been aimed at rooting out the drug kingpins or the most violent offenders. Never has. Never has. Federal funding in this war has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer volume of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. State and local law enforcement agencies are rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system for drug offenses. This helps to explain why law enforcement so often goes out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible, pulling as many vehicles as possible over in a search for drugs. But of course, they don't do that so much in middle-class white neighborhoods. They don't sweep college campuses and universities for drugs, though plenty can be found there, I can assure you. No. These tactics are applied only in poor communities of color, because that's where they can get away with it and still get paid. And the results are predictable. People of color have been rounded up in mass for relatively minor, nonviolent drug offenses. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in fact, in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug has now been shown to be less harmful, less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging the drug war exclusively in the hood, we've managed to create a vast new racial undercast in an astonishingly short period of time. Millions of people are now saddled with criminal records and legally denied the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement.